Hey, how's it going? I wanted to talk about a topic that I've been thinking about for the past week or so. We had a conversation last week on our Catalyzing Coherence channel where I host with Brian Hofstein. If you haven't checked that out, I would highly recommend doing so. But we had a conversation last week with John Connors of Starfish Mission about decentralization versus centralization and the tension that's inherent between those two poles or points of polarity within complex systems. And after we had that conversation, I also came across the conversation between Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin, in which they were discussing the role of government, and also saw a lot of different videos that were kind of spin-offs after that conversation, talking about how Joe Rogan got Dave Rubin in a logic chokehold, or Dave Rubin was schooling Joe Rogan about the evils of government. And it struck a chord in a way that relates to a lot of what not only we talked about last week with respect to centralization and decentralization, but also a deeper chord that runs in terms of a pattern with respect to emergence in complex systems and the emergence of ordered systems or ordered structure within otherwise chaotic systems that are composed of many actors, many people, many bacteria, many animals, many birds, and it's a pattern that people really need to be familiar with before they wade into these conversations and set up unnecessary dichotomies between the idea of the abstraction of government on one side and the ideal of the individual, the either anarchist or anarcho-libertarian or libertarian structures that are these purely bottom-up distributed systems, and acting as if that's enough to manage the complexity of our modern society. So where should we start here? I think we should start by really thinking about how these systems do emerge. And whether we're talking about bacteria or we're talking about people, we have different individuals over time that start organizing themselves closer to each other because there's some shared benefit. So if I am in a hunter-gatherer tribe and there's another tribe near me and we find some way to no longer fight or conflict, but find some sort of symbiotic relationship, perhaps exploiting one another's mutual or the non-overlapping specialties that might have existed within those two tribes, which would be a form of economic specialization or a trade relationship. What we would do is actually establish a connection, establish a bond between those two structures. And what that bond does is allow for the flow of resources between one structure and the other structure, between one group and the other group, whether that's a community or whether that's a coalescence of animals or bacterium. If you get these types of symbiotic relationships, you establish a bond that is made with flow. So you have sort of a gravitational energy keeping these two pieces of the system together. And as that scales, as those types of relationships scale, as you find more and more different pieces in the environment, you can imagine it like, okay, so now you have two groups, and so the territory, the border expands, and now you're actually more likely to have other groups on that border. And so if you find other groups on that now larger border that you have to, or that you want to establish new trading relationships with, or new bonds or symbiotic relationships with, you need to deal with a slightly more complex arrangement of how do you actually organize the internal system once those new participants enter the system. Okay, so what we're starting to see here is a pattern of beginning with these types of bottom-up structures, but over time, over evolutionary space and time, you get increased complexity within the border. And what happens, you can kind of look at that as a bottom-up emergence of a pyramid kind of building from the bottom to the top, or you can look at it as a graph where the center of that graph is getting more and more densely packed. And that makes things more complex. And you can say that every single individual should just be free. Every single agent in that marketplace should just have complete autonomy as market participants. Yet, the thing that you find out when you actually look throughout nature, or if you look at real systems of governance or real systems of economic transactions, is you have the emergence of actors who are capable of exploiting or dominating various parts of that market. You have anti-market forces emerging. You have people who are willing to use force in ways that are immoral or violate the norms of that community, or that are damaging to the structure of the organism. If you're talking about the lower levels of biology, you might have a virus entering a set of symbiotic bacteria. And so what that means is that you can't just trust people's good faith and goodwill, because the more value you create within the structure of the society or within the structure of the cell, the more value you create, you actually create higher incentives for any individual in that structure to defect, to steal, to cheat, to lie. If there's no punishment or enforcement mechanism, if the body doesn't have white blood cells, or if the society doesn't have any form of governance structure or relationship to itself to potentially enforce those types of norms or rules. And so going back to the conversation, it's really crazy to me and really frustrating to me whenever I speak with people on either side of this spectrum who are either can see no wrong in terms of the government's role or can see no right in terms of the government's role. Given the fact that what we have is a pattern of structure or a pattern of new forms of relationships that create mutual bonds, and then you have to have some way to organize or to cohere those at a higher level. You can't keep all the complexity of society on one plane. It has to start expanding or abstracting to higher levels that can start to enforce the rules of the system. Without that, you actually have very strict limits on the amount of complexity that can be contained with any given system. So how does this relate to specifically the argument that Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin were having? Well, the example was brought up of the construction industry and whether or not people would defect in this construction industry, whether or not people would actually build houses of sufficient quality, whether they would check the wiring, whether they would make sure that the insulation was up to standard or up to code if there were no code. And Rubin's argument was that the market would take care of this, and that there would be, perhaps there would be bad actors at first, yet over time, what would happen would be that the bad actors would get taken out of the market. And while there is truth in that, there are also limitations to that, because if you place the burden of, if you place this burden on the market, if you place the burden on effectively some sort of check in the market, you would most likely have some sort of service that would probably be external to the actual builders or contractors themselves, because that's kind of the way trust works. You don't necessarily trust the person who has the incentives to defect to tell you whether or not their work is of sufficient quality. So let's say that we have an entry of a new type of participant to the equation, and that person is a market-based code inspector. Okay, so we have a market-based code inspector, and maybe they do a great job, and you know what, maybe that is a solution, but you have to think about what the costs of that solution are as well. And so the cost of the market-based code inspector is that the market-based code inspector, A, has no authority. All they can do is tell the purchaser or the person who's paying for the project whether or not this is up to code. And they have to be brought in. Well, they don't necessarily have to be brought in, but if you want to ensure that it's up to code, you need to bring in another person. So now you have an additional person. So perhaps you were thinking that it would be a simpler solution if you could get rid of the government and you wouldn't have these types of bureaucratic, overly complex structures. Well, the market would most likely tend towards solving the same problems, yet in so doing, it would add additional actors to the situation. And so you would have additional actors actually adding to the complexity and therefore adding to friction, adding to extra money, extra costs. And yes, and you have a market and you have freedom and you have autonomy, but there are friction costs. There are transactional costs, or what are called Coasian costs, after the economist Ronald Coase, who did a lot of work trying to understand how economic systems might break down based on internal micro costs or micro frictions of various sorts. And I think that's really lost when you talk to a lot of libertarians about this abstract land of how these systems would just take care of themselves. Another element that you really want to consider when you're talking about these ideas is that there are standards, and standards also reduce the friction and costs of integration or incorporation. So you can think of, what other types of things do we have that are interfaces or integrations? Well, we have language. Language is an interface. Imagine if we had, in a way, no government centrally standardized language, and yet we ended up having these emergent standardizations of language that did cohere around very specific languages. And it evolves and it changes, but we also impose standards. We codify it into textbooks so that we can teach people a particular form of it at a particular point in time, so that people can have some amount of guarantee that the language that they're learning will actually be useful in the broader context of society. Okay, so take that back to the building metaphor. So if we had a purely market-based building ecosystem for all construction, and not just the construction, you have to take into consideration the supply chain, the parts, the creation, the manufacturing. If it was a purely market-based system, there would also be additional costs to coordination and cooperation to understand which of these standards or which of these types of products should be the market standard. But the thing is with a market is that you're always going to have competition trying to create new standards, right? And so this is the type of thing that we see with respect to, for example, the connecting peripherals to a Mac computer and Apple's evolution of, all of their fans becoming very angry every time a laptop is obsoleted or the peripherals for the laptop become cumbersome because they have to use 20 different dongles to connect the laptop to their camera. Now imagine if that were the case with respect to all of our architecture and all of our buildings and our roads and our plumbing and our electricity. Imagine if we had the types of coordination issues that we have now between nations, different nations with different power outlets or different structures, but within our own country, within neighborhood to neighborhood, block to block even perhaps. Small different developers creating their own little market-based niches and creating vertically integrated systems of products like Apple that don't actually interoperate with any other construction materials. No standardization, no containerization, so to speak. These are the types of things that most people who proffer the extreme libertarian arguments don't think through properly, don't necessarily have a good understanding of when they come to the table with an argument like, what has the government ever done? What good is the government? Because it's so easy to look at government structures that are, quite frankly, failing along many fronts. I am no fan of the past 30 years of the evolution of our governmental structures, and I do think we need a deep reset of the fundamental way our government works. But that being said, just like in any other situation on Earth, within any other system, we need to really understand what we have, be a little bit grateful for what's been given to us, a little bit grateful for the coherence and the stability that we have created for ourselves through this mechanism that we label government. But that's just the label, and this is the interesting thing as well. So let's pivot a little bit off of this idea of building materials in government, and let's talk right now about this decentralization versus centralization argument. And let's talk about this in the framework of thinking about Bitcoin, for example. So there are also many people out there who you might consider, or who might call themselves Bitcoin maximalists. There's a lot of crypto anarchists that overlap. So if you have a Venn diagram, there's a pretty large overlap in the middle there between the crypto anarchist community and these Bitcoin maximalists. And the interesting thing about that is when you talk to crypto anarchists, once again, you see this pattern emerging where people truly believe, that if only we could get rid of the government, if only we could get rid of this part of society, this thing called government, this abstraction that is the place where force is centered, that can use force, So if you look at people like Roger Ver, for example, he will use the most hyperbolic language you can ever imagine to talk about government. He'll talk about militaries as something like enforced slave labor, and talk about all taxation as theft. And the thing about that is, even if you get rid of government today and you replace it with a crypto infrastructure, if you look at evolutionary systems and you look at complex adaptive systems, what you realize is that most likely when the complexity begins to scale within the crypto anarchist system, you would start to see, once again, abstraction layers. You'd start to see a degree of centralization because you want certain types of standardization. You have certain types of efficiencies. Because when information or money or energy flows through a system, it wants to find these most efficient paths, these most effective paths. It doesn't want to be completely fragmented at all times. There's a gravitational force operating here at different scales. And when you have that type of emergent behavior, you're going to see new scales of order and emergence, new scales of emergent order form from the lower scales of complexity. And it's a universal pattern. It's a universal pattern. So if you're just talking about it in terms of governance, if you're just talking about it in terms of a government structure, if you're just talking about it in terms of centralization in the abstract, as if centralization and decentralization are not intertwined, as if you can have one without the other, as if they're not part of a continuously evolving dynamic system. If you're talking about it like that, you're not seeing the whole picture. You don't have the information that you need to make a compelling argument, because it is a much more complex topic than that. It goes far deeper than that. You have to understand the dynamics of the system. There is no one solution. The management of the solution is a flow. It is a dynamic, evolving solution that requires a balancing between understanding how far we've gone towards the side of overly bureaucratic, overly stale, overly inflexible regulations or systemic structures that are no longer capable of governing our accelerating technological world, which is true. And the other side of the coin, which is, the element of the fluidity. How do we know when we go too far towards the chaotic such that we are no longer getting any benefits of standardization, that we're reinventing wheels constantly, that we are getting no economies of scale, that we have no interoperability, and therefore become completely incoherent and dissipate into a milieu of hyper-individualistic yet collectively impotent structures. And when you look at it in that context, then you begin to see that what we're doing is a dance. We're doing a dance between these sides, and we're trying to figure out where we are in that balance. Where is the pendulum right now? And while I agree the pendulum is too far to the centralization side of the equation, particularly because of the artifacts of our evolutionary history, particularly because of the centralizing tendencies of pre-technological civilization, a civilization where we had to organize things literally in physical space because of the fact that we didn't have other ways of transmitting information. We didn't have telephones. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have financial systems that could travel in any way other than on horseback or on foot, carrying notes of debt or actual pieces of gold. So you have to understand that we are stuck to some extent with the downstream side effects of these structures that we created in a very different world. And yes, a lot of those need to be decomposed, reevaluated, thought through in terms of what still has a place in our modern world and what doesn't have a place in our modern world. But it doesn't help to frame things with this polarity of all government is bad, or people who think government is bad don't know what they're talking about because what about roads? These conversations are childish. These conversations are so oversimplified. They do not help anything. All they do is generate friction. All they do is generate heat. They don't generate insight. They don't generate new conversation. There are no new ideas with respect to this dichotomy of yes government, no government. That's a 3-year-old argument. I mean, come on, guys. Really, we need to get past this. And it's I was really upset to see Dave Rubin making these arguments with such low resolution, especially because he's spending so much time with Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson talks so frequently about the dangers of low resolution argumentation. And I would think that hopefully some of that would rub off on Dave Rubin. But it didn't seem to. And, it was frustrating. So I decided to make this video. And it's my first personal video just kind of talking to you all. I'll probably make some more of them in the upcoming future. Let me know if you enjoyed it. If you did, like it, comment, subscribe. Look forward to talking more. Also, our other channel, Catalyzing Coherence, is really awesome. We just did an amazing interview with Alexander Laszlo, who is the son of Edwin Laszlo and an amazing complexity scientist and researcher. Also really interested in weaving together science and spirituality. So that's going to be coming out over the next day or so on the Catalyzing Coherence channel. And you should totally check that out. If you're interested in more complex, more nuanced, more subtle conversations, we are going to have many of those upcoming, and that is one of them that I would highly recommend you take a look at. So in any case, have a wonderful day. I hope this was useful. I hope this provides some insight into the crazy chaos that we have and maybe a little bit better perspective in terms of how to approach these conversations moving forward. Dave, if you're listening, I would love to have this conversation with you. If not, perhaps we'll see each other one day. Have a good night, everybody.